Welcome to the corner of history where human decision-making takes a little vacation from logic. This is where legendary mistakes gather, so spectacularly bad they make your brain freeze like you just opened too many browser tabs at once. And if you've ever had a moment where you questioned your own judgment, don't worry. By the end of this list, you'll feel qualified to give life advice to strangers. So let's skip the long preamble and start with something simple. Simple enough to trigger consequences as heavy as an American hospital bill. 1. Thomas Austin, the man who just wanted to sprinkle a little authentic British flavor onto his Australian estate back in 1859, decided to release 24 European rabbits onto his land. A harmless idea, the kind of thing you do when you're bored and think, what's the worst that could happen? History probably looked down and sighed, oh, here we go again. The rabbits found paradise almost instantly. Endless land, food everywhere, zero predators, and a climate that might as well have been handcrafted for them. Their breeding speed could make any MLM business model jealous. In no time, they went from a couple of dozen to a marching army of hundreds of millions, sweeping across the continent like a storm with legs. They tore up grasslands, wrecked native ecosystems, and dragged Australia into a never-ending war no one had signed up for. The government built fences so long that the map started looking like someone with shaky hands drew the borders. They tried every costly method imaginable and eventually realized they were fighting nature's own infinite reproduction cheat code. One small idea, one entire continent is in chaos. And if you ever underestimate the power of impulsive decisions, remember this. Austin just wanted a few rabbits to hunt. The rabbits wanted a continent. 2. Xerxes I, king of Persia, was the perfect example of having too much power and absolutely zero impulse control. When he ordered massive pontoon bridges built across the Hellespont so he could march his army into Greece, a natural storm wiped the entire structure out. Most leaders would sigh, blame unpredictable weather, and start rebuilding. But Xerxes operated on a different operating system. He decided the sea had insulted him. And in his mind, when you feel insulted, the only reasonable response is, punish the ocean. So the Persian soldiers received one of the strangest, most pointless assignments in military history. Line up along the shore and whip the water hundreds of times. Not only that, they threw chains into the sea as if declaring, you are under arrest. A grand ceremony of discipline directed at a massive body of salt water with no ability to hear, see, or care. If TikTok had existed back then, this would have gone viral across the entire empire. The ocean, like every ocean for millions of years, ignored everything. It did not apologize, did not react, simply kept doing its job, making waves, destroying anything built where it shouldn't be, and watching humans wrestle with their own pride. And so Xerxes continued his campaign, fully convinced he had a disciplined nature. Meanwhile, history just stood off to the side, quietly noting that this was one of the rare times humans declared war on water. 3. In the grand archive of Rome's most ridiculous moments, no one outshines Emperor Honorius, the man who proved that a lack of focus can do more damage than a storm. In 410, the Goths attacked the city of Rome. For an empire that once dominated half the known world, this was the highest level of alarm imaginable. The symbolic heart of the empire was burning. Citizens were panicking, and a messenger rushed in with urgent news. Rome has fallen. In any sane scenario, the expected reaction would be shock, frantic meetings, troop mobilization, something to save what was left. Honorius breathed a sigh of relief instead. And the reason history still shakes its head, he thought they meant his pet chicken. The chicken he had lovingly named Rome. For a few of the strangest seconds in imperial history, the ruler of the entire Roman Empire was worried about exactly one thing: poultry. When the messenger clarified that the real Rome, the city, not the bird, had fallen, the situation was already beyond rescue. The city was sacked, the empire's spirit shattered, and Rome took another heavy step toward its long decline. No one knows what ran through Honorius's mind in that moment, but the story survives for a simple reason. It shows that sometimes a nation isn't brought down by an enemy, but by the odd priorities of the person steering the ship. An empire was burning. A chicken was not. And Honorius chose the chicken. 4. The 18th century had its share of brilliant inventions, and its fair share of experiments that history can't help but laugh at. François Anglet, often considered the father of modern roller skates, firmly belonged to the second category. He didn't just want to invent the first pair of skates. He wanted the debut to be unforgettable, the kind of make history moment people would talk about for years. And like any performance fueled by too much confidence, things were guaranteed to slide off course. Anglet chose a lavish Parisian ballroom as his stage. The plan sounded simple enough: glide smoothly through the crowd on his skates while playing the violin. An elegant combination of art and danger that absolutely no one asked for. But he forgot one crucial detail: brakes. He invented the skates, but not a way to stop. If there was ever a moment in life that begged for an undo button, this was it. As he rolled into the grand hall, people were amazed. Everything unfolded exactly the way he imagined. Until his speed picked up, his direction drifted, and directly ahead stood a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror. No brakes, no escape route, nothing between him and an incoming disaster. The next moment was a shattering crash that echoed through the room. Glass destroyed, violin destroyed, and Anglet's pride destroyed right along with them. What began as a dazzling performance instantly became the biggest accident of the night. A wonderful invention, an unforgettable moment, and one simple lesson: skating is easy, stopping is the hard part. 5. Sultan Ibrahim of the Ottoman Empire was the perfect example of having immense power, while the ability to think clearly lagged miles behind. They called him Ibrahim the Mad, and history wasn't exaggerating. Ibrahim was famous for his endless suspicion, and his harem of 280 women was where his paranoia burned the brightest. One day, he suddenly convinced himself that someone in the harem had been unfaithful. A normal person would investigate, ask questions, or at least think twice. Ibrahim chose the nuclear option version of problem solving, like wiping an entire hard drive. He didn't look for a culprit. He didn't check a single detail. He decided to deal with everyone. All 280 women were tied into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. A punishment so extreme that even his most loyal advisors looked at one another as if asking, "Are we really doing this?" The issue wasn't just the cruelty, it was the way Ibrahim acted, as if an entire empire could be reset at any moment when he panicked. Instead of addressing the problem, he hit delete all and hoped for the best. A mindset that works for clearing computer junk, not running a country. The act pushed the court deeper into chaos, tanked royal credibility, and sealed Ibrahim's reputation as the kind of ruler history can only sigh about. The simple conclusion: power doesn't always come with wisdom. In Ibrahim's case, it only made his mistakes spread faster. 6. If there were an award for small idea, enormous consequences, Thomas Austin wouldn't be the only one competing for the trophy. Because right after him, history served up another strong contender: the bird version of Thomas Austin. His name was Eugene Schieffelin, a New York pharmacist with a peculiar passion, introducing every bird mentioned in Shakespeare's works into America. Loving art is respectable. Turning it into a wildlife experiment? That's where things went off the rails. Schieffelin released about 60 European starlings into Central Park simply because Shakespeare mentioned them exactly once. A reason so flimsy that if Shakespeare rose from the grave, he'd probably apologize to the birds. But starlings have no shame. They multiplied like New York was an open-call audition for territorial conquest. Within a few decades, they spread across the entire country, driving out native birds, wrecking crops, and even causing airplane disasters. A literary project that turned into a nationwide ecological nightmare. No one in New York imagined that a few dozen birds released for a romantic whim would become an army of hundreds of millions. But nature doesn't care about poetry. It responds in the only way it knows how: multiply, dominate, and cause chaos. All because one Shakespeare fan got a little too creative. 7. History has plenty of strange moments, but few compare to the time a pope put a corpse on trial. Yes, really. Pope Stephen VI decided to hold a full courtroom proceeding against his predecessor, who had been dead for 9 months. It all started with a personal grudge. Stephen VI hated Pope Formosus, and instead of letting it go like an adult, he handled it as if he were filming a medieval reality show. He had Formosus's body dug up, dressed it in papal robes, propped it on a throne like an actual defendant, and staged a public trial before the entire church. A corpse obviously can't defend itself, so Stephen appointed a young deacon as the defense attorney, a job roughly equal to defending the honor of a decaying bag of bones. And unbelievably, The trial was conducted seriously. Charges, questioning, sentencing. Every formal step you'd expect in a functioning court. The result was predictable. Formosus was convicted, his fingers were cut off, his corpse was dragged through the streets, and then tossed into the Tiber River. A personal vendetta carried out on a national stage with a level of absurdity that stunned all of medieval Europe. History calls it the Cadaver Synod, but honestly, a more accurate name would be the trial that proved humans will do anything, even what no one asked for. 8. Some mistakes come from a lack of information, others from an oversized ego, but Shah Muhammad II managed to reach an entirely different level, a disaster born from trying to flex power at the wrong time, in the wrong place, and against the absolute wrong opponent. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan sent a delegation of merchants and envoys to the Khwarezm Empire to open trade routes, a peaceful gesture, your standard mutual benefit proposal. But Muhammad II saw it as a challenge, as if the great Khan was pretending to be friendly just to test him. Then came the decision that made history blink. He ordered the entire delegation killed, including the official envoys. In diplomacy, this is the equivalent of hitting the self-destruct button. There's an unwritten rule that stretches across every civilization. Never kill a Mongol messenger. Genghis Khan's response was completely predictable. Not anger, just annihilation. The invasion that followed was fast, brutal, and so thorough that Khwarezm was nearly erased from the map. Cities leveled, populations wiped out, an empire crushed under the most effective military force on Earth. Muhammad II didn't just make a mistake, he chose the one action guaranteed to produce catastrophe. This wasn't a bad decision, it was a runway paved for irreversible destruction. When people talk about how not to handle diplomacy, this is example number 1. 9. If there were a book titled The Fastest Ways to Destroy Your Own Country, Francisco Solano Lopez, the 19th century dictator of Paraguay, would absolutely write the longest chapter. He saw himself as the Napoleon of South America, a level of confidence far larger than his actual abilities. Fueled by that grand delusion, Lopez launched a war whose outcome even a child could predict. He declared war on Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay at the same time. One small nation taking on 3 opponents that were bigger, richer, and far more powerful. This wasn't strategy. It was an open invitation to catastrophe. Paraguay back then was tiny and resource poor, but Lopez believed sheer willpower could compensate for everything else. History immediately proved him wrong. The war became a nationwide military disaster. Paraguay's army was crushed, its economy collapsed, and the male population dropped so drastically that the next generation faced a severe shortage of men. An estimated 70% of Paraguayan men died in the conflict, a number so staggering it's hard to believe unless you remember it was driven by a leader making choices at the very peak of bad decision-making. Lopez didn't just lose. He left behind a devastated nation that took decades to recover, becoming the textbook example of what happens when a leader misjudges both his own strength and his enemies. Confidence can be a powerful thing until it's aimed in the wrong direction. In Lopez's case, it became the weapon that destroyed his own country. 10. Guarding a Roman emperor was never a job for gentle souls, but the Praetorian Guard took aggressive to an entirely wrong level. They assassinated emperors, installed new ones, and basically operated like an unregulated private security company with swords. So when Pertinax took the throne in 193, he made a choice no politically sane person would ever make. He cut the salaries of the very soldiers who had the power to kill him. Pertinax wanted to reform the empire, clean up corruption, and restore discipline. Noble goals. But starting by messing with the paychecks of the men holding weapons outside your bedroom? That's the kind of mistake even a beginner playing a strategy game wouldn't make. The Praetorian Guard didn't respond with complaint letters or polite suggestions. They reacted in the way their industry was known for. They stormed the palace and ended his reign after just 87 days. So short he didn't even have time to warm the throne. Pertinax's death wasn't just tragic, it was the perfect example of misreading the very group you're trying to reform. No one wins when trying to teach ethics to people whose job history includes ending emperors' careers faster than a termination notice. A good reform pointed at the wrong audience. And the reign of Pertinax ended with a simple reminder: if you want to survive, don't start by cutting the income of the people who decide how long you get to live. 11. Roman history has no shortage of chaos, but few moments surpass the day the most powerful empire on earth. went up for public auction, and at the center of this tragicomedy stood Didius Julianus, the man who proved that while money can buy power, it can't buy respect or political survival. After Pertinax was killed by the Praetorian Guard, the soldiers decided to try out a new business model, auctioning off the imperial throne to whoever offered the highest bid. Not an election, not a council vote, an actual auction, like a fancy night market where the prize just happened to be an empire. Julianus, a wealthy senator, entered the contest with exactly one strategy: outbid everyone. No military reputation, no public support, no plan for governing, just a very full wallet. He won. Or more accurately, he bought the Roman Empire. The problems started instantly. Armies across the empire refused to acknowledge him. The Roman public was furious. Powerful generals saw the auction as an open invitation to overthrow him. And among them, Septimius Severus marched toward Rome without asking for permission from anyone. Julianus ruled for a grand total of 66 days, shorter than the warranty on most electronic devices. In the end, he was executed, and the lesson he left behind couldn't be clearer. If you have to buy the throne with cash, you're probably not the right person to sit on it. 12. If you think absurd bans only exist in modern times, Sultan Murad IV of the Ottoman Empire will make you reconsider. He believed every social problem stemmed from coffee houses. Not alcohol, not gambling, not corrupt officials. Coffee. Murad IV insisted that coffee houses encouraged overly flexible thinking because people sat together and talked too much. And instead of regulating them, he chose the nuclear option: ban coffee entirely across the empire. Not just ban it, he personally disguised himself and patrolled the streets at night to catch violators. The punishment? Execution on the spot. Meanwhile, his own favorite drink was the real troublemaker: strong liquor. History notes that Murad IV drank so heavily that even the doctors of his time worried about his liver. But he remained convinced that coffee was the true threat, dragging the empire down. So people drank it in secret like criminals. Underground coffee houses operated like covert organizations, and society entered an era where a simple morning cup could make your hands shake. Literally. This story survives not just because of its absurdity, but because it proves a timeless truth. Nothing is more dangerous than someone with power who doesn't understand what they're trying to outlaw. If Murad IV lived today, he'd probably think Wi-Fi causes rebellion and ban routers after 9 at night. 13. If you've ever procrastinated on a deadline, take comfort. You've never procrastinated on a national level like King Louis XVI. When the French Revolution erupted, everything around him was on fire, literally and politically. The people were rising, nobles were fleeing, and all of Europe was watching to see what would happen next. At a moment that demanded decisiveness, Louis chose the approach of whatever happens, happens. When things became too dangerous, he and the Queen decided to flee Paris. A reasonable choice would have been quiet, discreet, fast. Louis XVI managed to break all 3 rules with a plan best described as broadcasting your location in real time. He selected a brand new, oversized, luxurious, slow-moving carriage, something as subtle as a traveling billboard. Along the route, the royal family stopped for leisurely meals, chatted with locals, and let people get a good look at them, as if this were a weekend getaway rather than an escape from national collapse. By the time they reached Varennes, a local man compared Louis's face to the image on a coin and recognized him immediately. The escape ended on the spot. Louis was arrested and taken back to Paris, disappointing both supporters and enemies alike. The failed flight became a symbol of complete detachment from reality. It wasn't the revolutionaries who caught him, it was the choices he made from the very beginning. There are daring rescue plans, and then there's Louis XVI's, an afternoon outing disguised as a national escape. 14. If history needed a poster child for solving problems by paying them to go away, Ethelred the Unready, 10th century King of England, would win the trophy without competition. His nickname didn't mean unprepared, it meant lacking wisdom. And honestly, history nailed it. England at the time was constantly attacked by Viking raiders. Instead of strengthening the army or building defenses, Ethelred chose a solution that sounded simple but carried consequences that wouldn't end for generations. He paid the Vikings to leave. This payment was known as the Danegeld, a medieval version of "please don't wreck my house." At first, the plan seemed to work. The Vikings took the money and sailed home. But then they realized something obvious. If they kept coming back, they'd keep getting paid. No battles, no risk, maximum profit, a perfect business model. So every year, they returned like loyal customers to a very generous restaurant. And Ethelred, instead of noticing he was getting financially skinned, kept paying, draining the royal treasury like a college student's bank account at the end of the month. The result? England grew weaker, the Vikings grew stronger, and Ethelred went down in history as the king who accidentally turned his entire country into a medieval ATM. The lesson is simple. Bribing invaders only works if you're certain they won't return. And if those invaders are Vikings, good luck with that. 15. If there were ever a man who made the entire planet want to switch to airplane mode just to avoid further damage, it would be Thomas Midgley Jr., the American scientist with a terrifying resume. 2 major inventions, both catastrophic for Earth. In the 1920s, Midgley created leaded gasoline to reduce engine knocking. It sounded clever until the world learned that lead is a neurotoxin, and not a mild one. It's long-lasting, widespread, and clingy in the way only the worst pop-up ads can be. Millions were affected, and the planet began to struggle for breath both literally and figuratively. But Midgley didn't stop there. He went on to develop CFCs, Freon, the miracle refrigerant everyone praised, until scientists discovered it punched a hole through the ozone layer, the only shield standing between humanity and deadly solar radiation. In other words, he nearly put Earth in permanent no-sunscreen mode. Later in life, after contracting polio, Midgley designed a system of ropes and pulleys to help lift himself out of bed, and in a tragically on-brand ending, he became entangled in the device and died by accident, taken out by yet another one of his own inventions. Not everyone leaves a mark on history, but Midgley left 2 global disasters and 1 brutal lesson. Intelligence without responsibility is far more dangerous than ignorance. On the leaderboard of mistakes, he didn't just stand out, he set a record. 16. Humanity has always chased the dream of eternal youth, but few pursued it in a way as dangerously self-destructive as Alexander Bogdanov, the Russian revolutionary and physician who believed rejuvenation could be achieved through blood transfusions. Not controlled studies, not methodical research, just direct transfusions, as many as possible. Bogdanov even founded a research institute and began running bold experiments on himself. After each transfusion, he claimed he felt stronger, his hair darker, his eyesight sharper. It all sounded promising, though no one could tell whether it was real progress or just optimism on overdrive. On his 12th transfusion, he chose to receive blood from a young student. Small problem. The student had both malaria and tuberculosis. Any ordinary scientist would have screened the donor, but Bogdanov had so much faith in his theory that he ignored every warning sign. And right after the procedure, the inevitable happened. He contracted both diseases and died shortly afterward. Instead of discovering the secret to eternal youth, Bogdanov became the living, and then very quickly deceased, proof that science does not reward blind recklessness. The world lost an intriguing thinker, and history gained a sharp lesson. If you want to chase immortality, at least check the donor first. One mistake is forgivable. Infecting yourself on purpose? Less so. 17. The 19th century had its share of strange intellectual movements, but few quenched the imagination quite like Charles Fourier's prediction that in a perfectly harmonious future the world's oceans would turn into lemonade. The real problem was that Alfred Brisbane, an American scholar, believed this so seriously that history can't decide whether to laugh or worry. Brisbane didn't read Fourier for entertainment. He poured his entire fortune and life into promoting this theory, treating it like scientific truth simply waiting for its grand reveal. He held lectures, wrote books, and built supporter groups, all centered on the vision that one day humanity would stand at the shoreline and sip the sea. In his eyes, every social problem would disappear the moment the waves tasted sweet and citrusy. No one thought it was a joke, but no one expected him to believe it literally either. And the funniest part? There wasn't a shred of scientific evidence, no natural observation, no logical framework supporting the idea, just a belief so strong it could wrestle logic to the ground. Brisbane spent his final years waiting for that miracle. But the oceans stayed salty, stayed blue, and absolutely refused to taste like lemonade. His story reminds us that belief can be powerful, just not always in ways that quench your thirst. 18. If you've ever dealt with a leader whose decisions made everyone stop and ask, why, then Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the 14th century Sultan of Delhi, will make them all look reasonable. He was a master of big ideas with even bigger consequences. His first brilliant move was relocating the entire capital from Delhi to Dowlatabad, more than 1,000 kilometers away. Not part of the population, not just the royal court, everyone. The elderly, children, the sick, merchants, farmers. The entire city was forced to march on foot through brutal conditions. Thousands died along the way, and once they finally arrived, Tughlaq changed his mind and ordered everyone to go back. If that weren't enough, he followed up with a monetary reform so disastrous that economists still use it today as an example of never do this. He allowed citizens to mint their own currency. He declared that copper and brass coins would hold the same value as gold. Naturally, the entire nation instantly became amateur coin makers. Every household stove turned into a miniature mint. Within a short time, the financial system collapsed. Currency value plunged. The economy spun out of control like a marketplace with no one in charge. Tughlaq had to revoke the entire new currency system. By then, the damage was beyond repair. He wasn't cruel. He was simply the perfect example of how a good idea can't survive terrible execution. And Tughlaq executed everything, terribly, on a national scale. 19. In the long history of warfare, few people repeated the same mistake with the unwavering commitment of Arthur III, Duke of Brittany. If someone ever said, "Don't make the same mistake twice," Arthur clearly didn't hear it. In fact, he made the same mistake 3 times, by getting captured. During the 100 Years' War, Arthur was a fiercely spirited French noble. But a strong spirit doesn't always equal strong survival instincts. In his first major battle, he was captured by the English. His family paid a hefty ransom to free him. This is the point where any reasonable person would rethink their battlefield strategy. Not Arthur. He went right back to fighting, right back to taking risks, and right back to being captured a second time. Another ransom. Another humiliation. Another round of "please be more careful next time." Arthur heard it all, and then did the exact opposite. He returned to battle yet again, and on the 3rd try, the English captured him once more, as if this were a regularly scheduled performance. To them, Arthur became a dependable source of recurring income, a kind of medieval subscription service that always renewed on time and always paid well. With 3 captures and 3 ransoms, Arthur became the living proof that bravery is admirable, but sometimes it shows up without risk assessment. Not everyone leaves a mark on history, but Arthur did, by becoming the only professional prisoner opponents actually looked forward to seeing again. 20. Being a king is already hard. Being a king while not even realizing you're ruling takes it to a whole new level. And that was exactly the case with Otto I of Bavaria, the monarch with the strangest reign in Europe. 27 years on the throne without actually governing anything. Otto had severe mental illness from a young age and was declared incapacitated before he even inherited the crown. But succession laws didn't care about little details like that. So Bavaria suddenly had a king who was legitimate on paper, while actual power rested in the hands of a regency council, people whose main job was keeping everything calm so the public wouldn't panic. While the country wrestled with politics and economics, Otto lived isolated in the palace like a non-functioning NPC. He didn't attend meetings, didn't sign decrees, and didn't receive foreign envoys. Some records even say he spent his time standing by a window, firing a gun randomly into nearby fields, forcing local farmers to live in a constant state of, "please let him be asleep today." Otto's reign had no reforms, no victories, no legacy, just the bizarre tale of a king who existed without participating in any part of being a king. Bavaria didn't collapse, but it absolutely spent 27 years pretending everything was normal while the man at the top wasn't really there. If history ever held a contest for most passive king, Otto would win instantly. His first victory achieved without him even knowing he was competing. 21. Chinese history has no shortage of emperors obsessed with immortality, but few chased that dream by slowly poisoning themselves for years, the way Emperor Jiajing of the Ming dynasty did. He wasn't interested in governing, didn't care about war, and paid even less attention to his people. Every ounce of his energy went into one singular mission, living forever. And to achieve it, he trusted Taoist alchemists who produced elixirs of immortality, mystical-sounding potions whose main ingredient was mercury. In normal logic, drinking poison every day means dying faster. But in the logic of an emperor desperate for eternal life, mercury suddenly became a daily vitamin. Jiajing took it faithfully, confidently, enthusiastically, convinced it was making him stronger. In reality, he was slowly destroying his liver, kidneys, and nervous system piece by piece. While the court sank into corruption, the economy spiraled, and the people suffered, Jiajing kept chugging his immortality elixir like an ancient influencer promoting the world's most dangerously mislabeled supplement. Eventually, the inevitable happened. He died from the very concoction he believed would make him eternal. History remembers it as one of the clearest examples of how the pursuit of immortality can make you die faster. If Jiajing had put even half the passion he had for drinking mercury into actually running his country, the Ming dynasty might have fared a whole lot better. 22. On the list of history's strangest self-defense strategies, no one beats Mithridates VI, king of Pontus. He was so obsessed with being poisoned that he turned his entire life into a traveling laboratory, with himself as the test subject. Mithridates believed the only way to avoid assassination by poison was to drink poison every day, not just one type, but every type he could get his hands on. Mild, lethal, rare, common. He mixed tiny doses and increased them gradually, like an extreme version of a build immunity program. The result? He actually became nearly immune to many toxins. If there had been a masterclass on the subject, he would have been the instructor. But the biggest lesson arrived exactly when he didn't expect it. After losing to Rome and facing capture, Mithridates chose an honorable death. He drank poison, the strongest, most secret blend he'd saved for the worst possible moment. But his body was too used to everything. Nothing happened. No pain, no paralysis, no death. He had succeeded so thoroughly that he broke his own escape plan. In the end, he had to ask a loyal guard to kill him with a sword. A bitter end for a man who spent his entire life preparing for the one scenario his own efforts made impossible. Mithridates wasn't just a king. He was living proof that sometimes you can be too good at protecting yourself, to the point you have no way out. 23. History has seen its share of terrible political decisions, but few reach the level of sleepwalking a country into danger like the 19th century king of Cambodia, the man who believed his dreams were national strategy. According to records, one night the king dreamed that his entire naval fleet was wiped out. No context, no cause, no specific battle, just one of those strange, random human dreams. But instead of waking up and thinking, well, that was odd, he treated it as an unquestionable prophecy. The next morning, he issued an immediate order: dismantle the entire navy, not reduce the ranks, not change commanders, erase the country's entire maritime defense because of one restless night's sleep. No one in the court dared oppose him. How do you reason with someone who believes the sleeping brain is more accurate than advisors, generals, and centuries of real-world experience? And just like that, the fleet disappeared. Cambodia lost its most critical line of defense, and the kingdom became more vulnerable than ever. History doesn't record what the neighboring nations thought, but it's safe to assume they shared a quiet laugh. A country voluntarily disarming because of a dream is rare even in the most chaotic eras. This story reminds us of something simple. Predicting the future is hard, but replacing analysis with dream logic isn't just hard, it's dangerous. 24. If there were an Olympic sport for petty theft but at the head of state level, King Farouk of Egypt would take home the gold without competition. He wasn't the stern, commanding type of monarch. He was a full-time kleptomaniac, a man obsessed with stealing trinkets despite living in a palace overflowing with gold. Farouk had a strange habit. Anywhere he went, anything not explicitly labeled belongs to someone else, do not touch, was at risk of mysteriously disappearing. Decorations, silverware, small items, large items, anything could become a souvenir no one had agreed to give him. But his greatest moment came when he met Winston Churchill. Yes, that Churchill, the legendary British Prime Minister, not exactly someone easy to fool. During their meeting, while Churchill was distracted, Farouk quietly pocketed his beloved pocket watch. Not a cheap accessory, this was Churchill's constant companion, the sort of item one notices missing immediately. A few minutes later, Churchill realized what had happened, turned to him, and calmly asked for it back. No anger, no scene, just a gentle reminder. And Farouk, like a child caught red-handed, had no choice but to return it, trying to mask his embarrassment with an awkward smile. History remembers many kings for wars, reforms, or glory. Farouk is remembered for diplomatic-level petty theft. Stealing is bad enough, But stealing right in front of Winston Churchill, that's a level of reckless instinct beyond explanation. 25. If there were an award for signing your own death sentence without realizing it, Algernon Sidney, the 17th century English politician and philosopher, would win it outright. He wasn't undone by enemies, accidents, or war. He was executed because of an unpublished manuscript he wrote himself. Sidney opposed absolute monarchy. He rejected the idea that kings possessed any sort of divine right, and he poured those convictions into a long, passionate manuscript that he never published. Essentially, it was a private document, like personal notes you tuck away in a drawer. But misfortune struck when he was accused of treason. During the search of his home, authorities found that manuscript, and in one of the strangest legal decisions in English history, the court declared, "Two witnesses are unnecessary. A handwritten text criticizing the king is enough." In other words, Sidney provided the evidence for his own conviction, using arguments he wrote to intellectually challenge the monarchy, not to overthrow it. The result? He was sentenced to death, not for raising an army, not for plotting a coup, but for being too honest and too direct in a document he never intended anyone else to read. Sidney became a bitter reminder that sometimes words are more dangerous than weapons, and excessive honesty can send you out of this world sooner than planned. If there's one lesson here, be careful what you write, especially when you live under a king with a fragile ego. 26. During World War I, nations needed sharp military minds and leaders who understood strategy. Russia, however, chose a more creative route. Emperor Nicholas II, who had zero command experience, decided to appoint himself supreme commander of the army. A bold decision in the most literal sense. Bold because no one understood why. Before this, the Russian army had already suffered major defeats. Bad, but at least professional generals were still coordinating the chaos. Once Nicholas II placed himself at the top, every military failure that followed, and there were many, became directly attached to his name. Battle lines fell apart, logistics collapsed, and morale dropped to the basement. Meanwhile, Nicholas spent most of his time far from the front, unable to make strategic decisions and completely disconnected from reality on the ground. Advisors were confused, generals were sidelined, and soldiers looked at one another like they were watching a political disaster unfold in slow motion. The worst part, when people blamed him for those failures, he couldn't deny it, because he had insisted on taking command. The result was widespread anger, fueling the wave of unrest that led to the 1917 Russian Revolution. Nicholas didn't just lose control of the army, he lost his throne, and eventually his life. Not every bad decision collapses a nation, but putting a massive army into the hands of someone who's never held a tactical map makes it very easy. 27. In the 15th century, China possessed the most powerful navy on Earth. Massive ships, unmatched engineering, elite sailors, all under the command of the legendary Admiral Zheng He. They sailed as far as Africa and the Middle East, establishing trade networks and global influence. If there was ever a moment when China could have become a true maritime superpower, it was then. And then, the Ming court decided to throw it all away. The new leadership abruptly concluded that long-distance exploration was wasteful. No studies, no expert consultation, just a political U-turn born from an inward-looking agenda. They ordered all expeditions halted, disbanded the fleet, and, most absurd of all, commanded the destruction or abandonment of the great treasure ships. Vessels that once crossed the Indian Ocean were reduced to scrapwood. Decades of accumulated nautical knowledge faded into obscurity. The nation shrank inward, transforming from a rising oceanic giant into an insular state, leaving a global arena wide open for Europe to step into. The result? Only a few decades later, Portugal and Spain launched the age of exploration, while China watched from afar, no longer possessing a fleet capable of sailing the open seas. No war, no enemy, just an administrative decision that caused an entire empire to miss its golden moment. Sometimes history doesn't turn because of failure, but because someone thought burning the ships was the tidy thing to do. 28. Among history's most disastrous expeditions, the 1528 journey of Panfilo de Narvaez sits near the very top. He is living proof that overconfidence can vaporize an entire army in a matter of months. Narvaez set out for Florida with about 400 men, convinced he'd find gold, fertile land, and glory. But Florida back then wasn't a travel brochure. It was a maze of swamps, disease, humidity, mosquitoes that outnumbered humans, and terrain that would make even modern GPS give up. Instead of being cautious, Narvaez made the decision that doomed the expedition from the start. He split the group. He ordered the ships to sail along the coast while he led the soldiers overland straight through swamp country. No maps, no intel, no backup plan, just hope, and hope doesn't stand a chance against alligators. Predictably, the two groups never found each other again. Narvaez's men faced starvation, storms, disease, and local tribes who had absolutely no interest in entertaining strangers. They eventually tried to build makeshift rafts to cross the Gulf of Mexico, and that's when nature gently reminded them, "You do not know how to build boats." The result? Of the original 400 men, only 4 survived and made it back. Narvaez vanished at sea and was never found. This wasn't just a failed expedition. It was a step-by-step manual on how to lose an entire force without fighting a single battle. 29. Military history has plenty of famous last words, but none smack into reality harder than those of Union General John Sedgwick during the American Civil War. He was experienced, seasoned, and a commander who had led major battles. But sometimes all it takes is one moment of overconfidence for fate to step in. At Spotsylvania in 1864, Sedgwick was standing near the front while his men kept ducking to avoid long-range sniper fire. A perfectly natural reaction. Everyone did it. But Sedgwick thought they were being overly cautious. He stood tall, looked out across the field, and scolded them the way a strict teacher might tease students for being too careful with their homework. He insisted that sharpshooters at that distance couldn't hit an elephant. And to prove his point, he planted himself squarely in the open, no cover, as if conducting a scientific experiment, one no one had asked for, and one reality strongly advised against. Seconds later, history answered for him. A bullet tore through the air and struck him dead on the spot. The battle froze for a moment as soldiers tried to comprehend what had just happened. Sedgwick wasn't a foolish man, but he became a costly reminder that confidence is good, right up until it puts you exactly where the enemy's weapon is pointed. It was one of those rare moments when history, nature, and physics all spoke in unison. Don't challenge the laws of reality. 30. If there were an award for the worst deal in human history, Russia in 1867 would win it effortlessly for selling Alaska. At the time, the Russian Empire saw Alaska as a frozen, distant, useless stretch of land filled with nothing but ice and grizzly bears. Expensive to manage, barely profitable, and offering no future except making the map look awkwardly large. So Tsar Alexander II decided to sell the entire territory to the United States for $7.2 million, about 2 cents per acre. Americans at the time mocked the purchase, calling it Seward's folly, convinced their government had just paid a fortune for a natural deep freezer with no storage function. Then time passed, and Alaska revealed its true self: gold, oil, massive natural resources, strategic positioning, and a buffet of riches that sent its value skyrocketing. Everything Russia dismissed as useless ice turned out to be a powerhouse of wealth that boosted America's economic and military strength. Meanwhile, Russia looked back at the deal and likely experienced a collective facepalm powerful enough to rattle the Siberian fault lines. They sold off a region worth trillions today in exchange for an amount that wouldn't even buy a large office building in New York. Sometimes mistakes don't need dramatic flair. You just need to sign the contract. And that, my friend, is the final chapter in this journey through 30 spectacular blunders that accidentally shaped history. People who prove that humanity's story isn't built only by geniuses, but also tested for durability by decisions so bad even time wants to disown them. You've just walked through 30 plot twists of history, moments where logic collapsed and foolishness lit up like a stage spotlight. Thanks for sticking with it to the end. And remember, whenever you feel like you've done something stupid, just recall that someone once sold Alaska for 2 cents an acre. History set the bar very low. All we have to do is not trip over it.